A wedding photo is supposed to preserve happiness, but this one did the opposite. Because hidden in the background was a moment no one was meant to see. Who was the man standing too close to the bride? And why did the groom never notice until it was too late? This is a story about betrayal frozen in time, and how one image dismantled an entire marriage. It was a morning like any other in the Hale residence. Sunlight spilling weakly across the beige carpet, the soft hum of an air conditioner filling the kitchen, and the faint scent of brewed coffee lingering in the air. But for Ethan Hale, the day carried an inexplicable weight, a heaviness that made even routine movements feel deliberate. Months had passed since the wedding, since the vows, since the smiling faces captured on that day. Yet the past had a way of reappearing when least expected. The photograph arrived in the most mundane of ways. A digital file forwarded by a distant relative who insisted, almost too casually, that Ethan might want to see this. At first glance, it seemed harmless. A wedding group photo, candid and celebratory. Guests clustered tightly, faces painted with joy. The bride, Ethan's wife, Lena, glowing in a white lace gown that seemed to radiate perfection. But something was wrong. Ethan's gaze lingered on the periphery, tracing the background with a growing sense of unease. There, half obscured behind the crowd, stood a man. Someone Ethan had never noticed before, or perhaps had never allowed himself to see. The man's eyes were focused on Lena, but it wasn't the casual attention of a passerby. It was sharp, deliberate, intimate even. Ethan's throat tightened as he studied the subtle interaction frozen in pixels. A hand lightly brushing against a shoulder, a tilt of the head that suggested familiarity. Small, almost imperceptible gestures that now screamed louder than any shouted declaration. The room felt colder. Ethan sat, unmoving, as the hum of the air conditioner became a deafening background to the growing storm inside him. The photograph was simple, ordinary even, yet it carried the weight of accusation. It was as if time itself had trapped a truth he wasn't ready to confront. The edges of the image blurred under his unblinking stare, but the central figures remained vivid. Lena, radiant and unaware, and the man, a shadow of something forbidden. No one else in the house seemed to notice his sudden pallor. The morning moved forward mechanically, the clink of dishes, the rustle of newspaper pages, but Ethan remained caught in the frame, his mind unraveling around details that should have been inconsequential. He remembered the wedding day as a blur of laughter, vows, and fleeting glances, yet the photograph contradicted every memory he had of his marriage. Every smile, every handshake now seemed suspect. For a long moment, Ethan did nothing but breathe. The photo had arrived without explanation, without context, yet it demanded a response. He could not ask Lena about it, not yet. Something in him recoiled at the thought of confrontation, afraid of the answers, yet equally terrified of leaving the question unanswered. The camera of his mind began to replay moments, searching for inconsistencies, for signs that he had missed. Small memories surfaced. A glance exchanged, an unexplained phone call, laughter that sounded slightly too knowing. Each recollection fed a growing tension, a sense that the foundation of his world had shifted without warning. The quiet suburb, the familiar streets, even the house itself seemed suddenly alien, as if the photograph had rewritten reality while he slept. And then, finally, a decision formed. Not yet spoken, but palpable. He would need to understand. The photograph was only the beginning, the first thread of a pattern he had yet to see fully. What it revealed or concealed would shape the days ahead, forcing him to confront truths he had never imagined facing. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, letting the morning sun fall across his face. The unease remained, stubborn and heavy, but beneath it flickered something else. A cautious, determined resolve. This was not merely a photograph. It was a doorway, and he had no choice but to step through. Little did he know that the discovery of this single, ordinary image would mark the opening chapter of a psychological unraveling that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and betrayal. The wedding day unfolded under the pretense of perfection. Sunlight filtered through tall glass windows, casting long beams across the polished wooden floors of the chapel. Guests arrived in a quiet procession, faces bright with excitement and cameras at the ready. Every detail, centerpieces, floral arrangements, linen colors, had been meticulously planned, each element chosen to convey elegance, warmth, and unity. On the surface, the day was flawless. Yet beneath the carefully arranged smiles, a tension simmered, unseen but palpable. Lena Hale moved through the crowd with practiced grace. Her gestures were precise, her laughter measured, and her smiles seemingly effortless. She shook hands and embraced relatives with warmth that seemed genuine, yet her eyes occasionally flicked to spaces where no one stood, as though scanning for invisible signals. There were moments, a slight hesitation before turning to greet someone, a subtle tightening of her jaw that suggested she was performing the happiness expected of her. To everyone else, she was radiant, the embodiment of a bride in love. To those who looked closely, there were cracks in the facade. Ethan trailed just behind her, observing with the quiet intensity that had become part of his nature. He smiled at strangers, nodded politely at compliments, but his attention remained anchored to Lena. He remembered thinking how surreal it all felt. The colors, the music, the swirl of people celebrating a union he thought he fully understood. He did not notice the fleeting glances exchanged between Lena and certain guests, or the subtle ease with which she conversed with individuals who did not belong in the inner circle of family or friends. The ceremony began with ritualized elegance. Vows spoken in clear, unwavering voices, rings exchanged with solemnity, hands clasped tightly as the officiant's words echoed through the room. Cameras clicked, capturing moments meant to last a lifetime. Yet in the quiet, between the pronouncement of promises and the applause that followed, the narrative of the day shifted subtly. Lena's posture remained perfect, but her eyes carried a flicker of something else. Hesitation, calculation, perhaps regret. A fleeting shadow that, had anyone looked closely, might have hinted at the complexity beneath the surface. Reception followed, with music and dancing carefully orchestrated to maintain a veneer of joy. Laughter floated above the tables, mingling with clinking glasses and murmured congratulations. Yet even in the midst of celebration, Lena maintained a controlled distance. She smiled, she danced, but she never allowed herself to be entirely consumed by the moment. Guests noticed her elegance but not the invisible barriers she had constructed, fences built of poise and practiced charm. For Ethan, the day was a blur of gratitude and relief. He believed in every word spoken, every promise made. Yet the careful choreography of smiles, the subtle divergences between warmth and distance, began to plant a seed of unease, an instinctive, unarticulated perception that not all truths were visible in daylight. As the night drew on, photographs were taken, toasts were given, and laughter echoed through the decorated hall. One image, in particular, captured the event perfectly. Lena, radiant and poised, surrounded by friends and family. It seemed innocuous, a record of happiness. But for reasons Ethan could not yet understand, it would later become the first window into a hidden reality, a revelation that would shatter the illusion of perfection he had spent the day believing in. And so, beneath the carefully staged smiles and ceremonial flourishes, the tension that had quietly existed all along lingered, invisible yet undeniable. A reminder that even the most beautiful day can conceal the beginnings of chaos. The photograph, taken in passing, preserved more than celebration. It preserved a subtle betrayal, a moment that would ultimately force Ethan to question everything he thought he knew about his wife, and about love itself. In the shadows of joy and orchestrated grace, the seeds of doubt were sown, quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. Weeks after the wedding, Ethan found himself alone in the study, scrolling through the photographer's raw, unedited footage. What had initially seemed like harmless documentation, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the carefully choreographed dances, now demanded careful scrutiny. He rewound and paused repeatedly, frame by frame, compelled by a sense he could not yet name. It was in the margins of these images, these fleeting frames, that something unsettled him. A man appeared, at first barely noticeable, lurking at the edges of group shots. He was not among the close family, not part of the wedding party, not someone introduced in passing. Yet he was present and present too often. In one shot, he lingered near Lena as she adjusted her veil. In another, he appeared just behind her, a hand raised in greeting to someone Ethan could not see. The footage revealed a consistency that could not be dismissed as coincidence. His presence was deliberate, repeated, calculated. The documentary tone of Ethan's inner narrative dissected everything. The angle of the man's body, the subtle lean toward Lena, the brief but unmistakable glances exchanged between them. These were not casual social gestures. They were intimate in ways that only the camera, in its unflinching honesty, could capture. Ethan began cataloging the frames mentally, noting each moment when the figure drew near, each instance that contradicted the cheerful narrative he had clung to since the wedding day. It was a slow, creeping process. At first, he tried to rationalize. Perhaps the man was a family friend, a distant cousin, someone who had been forgotten in introductions. But logic faltered as he traced the footage further. Each appearance seemed contextually impossible, yet undeniably there. The more he watched, the more his mind shifted from denial to suspicion. Something, he realized, had been hiding in plain sight all along, masked by ceremony, celebration, and the illusion of happiness. Ethan's pulse quickened as he noticed details he had never seen in the photographs displayed at the reception. The man's stance, the subtle ways he mirrored Lena's movements, the occasional brush of a hand or tilt of a head. All of it suggested a familiarity that should not have existed. Every clip was a puzzle piece, and together they formed a pattern Ethan could no longer ignore. The veneer of a perfect day was cracking, revealing shadows that had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. The quiet of the study amplified every small noise, the soft click of the mouse, the low hum of the computer fan, as though the house itself recognized the significance of what he was seeing. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his eyes, feeling the weight of recognition settle in. For the first time, he questioned the narrative he had believed, the trust he had given so freely. The man in the background was more than an incidental figure. He was a signal, a warning, and a reflection of the doubts Ethan had suppressed since the wedding day. And yet, the footage alone did not provide answers. There was no confrontation, no confession, only the silent testimony of frames frozen in time. Ethan understood that he was at a crossroads. Ignore what he had seen, or pursue it further, letting the uncertainty erode the calm that remained. As he closed the footage and stared at the wedding photograph once more, the unease solidified. The background figure, once invisible, was now the center of his awareness, a phantom that haunted every memory of the day. The next step was unavoidable. He would have to confront the reality behind the smiles, the staged perfection, and the subtle betrayals that had gone unnoticed until now. The silent presence in the background had become a pivot point, marking the end of denial and the beginning of a search that would change everything. The photograph haunted Ethan long after the footage had been set aside. It lingered at the edge of his mind, a persistent reminder that what he remembered might not be what had truly happened. Alone in his bedroom, he traced the contours of the image, recalling snippets of laughter, shared glances, and whispered promises. Yet each recollection now felt fragile, suspicious, like a script he had unknowingly been following. He replayed moments from the early days of his relationship with Lena. Their first date, a quiet cafe downtown, seemed warm and spontaneous in memory, but now he questioned the small details. Did she really laugh at the joke he thought had charmed her? Or had he simply projected that meaning onto her expression? Even the simpler memories, walks through tree-lined streets, late-night conversations over coffee, were now tinged with doubt. Each recollection, once comforting, became a terrain of uncertainty. Fragmented conversations floated through his mind. "I missed you today," she had said, her voice soft, almost intimate. "Don't worry about it," he had replied, thinking it sincere. But hearing it now in his own memory, the words seemed rehearsed, stripped of spontaneity. He questioned the authenticity of every exchange, every tender gesture. Had he truly known her, or had he only known the version she allowed him to see? Ethan found himself scanning mental snapshots of past events with the meticulous attention of an investigator. The photograph, once a single moment frozen in time, now expanded to color every memory he had shared with Lena. Moments that had seemed natural now appeared orchestrated. Glances exchanged across a crowded room now hinted at unseen signals, hidden agendas. The photograph had shifted from simple evidence into accusation, implying a narrative that had been quietly unfolding beyond his perception. The psychological conflict took root quickly. Love, once a comforting certainty, began to reshape itself into suspicion. Every smile he remembered became a question mark. Every shared secret, a potential deception. Ethan recognized the destructive clarity forming in his mind. The more he examined memories, the less he trusted them, and the less he trusted them, the more he examined. It was a feedback loop of doubt, spiraling toward a truth he could not yet name. Even the smallest gestures, now recalled with hyper-awareness, carried unintended weight. Lena's casual touches, once reassuring, were dissected as deliberate signals. The warmth in her laughter seemed calculated. The affectionate glances he had treasured appeared to align too closely with the invisible background figure, creating a web of suspicion he could not ignore. Memory, Ethan realized, was malleable, bending under the pressure of knowledge yet to be confronted. In these reflections, dialogue appeared sparingly, brief flashes of conversation that now felt like fragments of a play. A late-night phone call, a fleeting kiss, a whispered apology. All became data points in a growing investigation of his own life. Each recollection provoked unease. Each memory questioned the authenticity of the happiness he had believed in so completely. By the end of the day, Ethan felt the photograph's gravity in a way that went beyond the image itself. It was no longer a single frame captured by a camera. It was a lens through which the entirety of his relationship was refracted. Doubt had transformed from a whisper into a constant companion, reshaping the world he had once taken for granted. The question that had been buried at the edges of his consciousness, the question of whether he had ever truly known Lena, emerged fully now, demanding attention. And as he set the photograph down on the nightstand, Ethan understood that the next step could not be postponed. He would have to confront the past, dissect his memories, and seek the truths that hid in plain sight. Memory had begun to lie, and Ethan had no choice but to follow its trail into the shadows of what had seemed like love. The man had begun to take shape in Ethan's mind, though he remained unnamed, faceless beyond the frames of photographs and fleeting glimpses caught in wedding footage. He was a presence defined by proximity, by the subtle insistence with which he inserted himself into spaces Lena occupied. Cafes she visited, bookstores she lingered in, the small corner of the park where she often jogged. Ethan traced these moments after the fact, seeing patterns that seemed impossible to dismiss. Each coincidence, once invisible, now demanded interpretation. It was the quiet, almost imperceptible moments that unnerved him most. In one frame, the man lingered near the buffet table at the reception, eyes cast toward Lena, a hand raised in greeting he never offered to anyone else. Another photograph captured him outside the chapel, partially hidden by the columns, watching as she laughed with Ethan. The repetition was too consistent to be random. The man existed in overlapping spheres of Lena's life, a silent witness, and yet, more than a witness, an active participant whose intentions remained shrouded. Cinematic in its unfolding, Ethan replayed mental scenes with painstaking attention. He visualized the garden where Lena had posed for portraits, the bright petals of the floral arch contrasting with the dark silhouette of the man standing at the edge. Every movement, every glance, became amplified under the scrutiny of suspicion. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in his recollections, as if the world itself had bent toward revelation. Near misses became the defining motif. The man never approached directly, never spoke openly, never revealed his connection, but the proximity was deliberate. Lena's laughter, the light in her eyes, the tilt of her head toward him, all carried a familiarity Ethan could not reconcile. The emotions he had once interpreted as shared intimacy now seemed to belong, in part, to someone else entirely. Betrayal, though unspoken and unseen, felt real. Ethan's inner monologue dissected these coincidences with clinical precision. Each instance of the man's presence was cross-referenced against memories of conversations and gestures. A lunch date Lena had mentioned casually, a hurried explanation about a colleague, a smile directed at someone from work. All began to coalesce into a pattern too pointed to ignore. He noted the precision of timing, the invisible choreography between her movements and the man's appearances. Yet the affair was not confirmed. Ethan knew this. There was no confrontation, no confession, no explicit evidence beyond the silent testimony of repetition and placement. Still, the emotional weight of the suspicion was undeniable. It pressed upon him with the force of certainty, even as rational thought whispered restraint. The photograph, the footage, the near misses, they were fragments of a narrative that had yet to be fully written. In quiet moments, he imagined the conversations that might have passed between Lena and the man. He filled in silences, read between the lines of gestures, inferred familiarity from the curvature of a smile, the turn of a head. These imagined exchanges felt almost real, as if memory itself had begun to fabricate details to fit the growing shadow of doubt. The lines between truth and suspicion blurred, leaving only the persistent, gnawing feeling of emotional betrayal. Ethan's thoughts returned repeatedly to the photograph that had started it all, the single frame where everything had shifted. The man, once a background figure, had become central to the narrative unfolding in his mind. It was not the clarity of proof that unsettled him. It was the certainty that something fundamental had changed. Trust, once absolute, now felt provisional, fragile, and incomplete. As the day faded into evening, Ethan understood that he could no longer ignore the presence that had crept into Lena's life and, by extension, into his own. The next step was inevitable. He would need to confront the possibility of truth behind the carefully orchestrated appearances, to see beyond the staged smiles and polite gestures, and to face what the photographs had only hinted at. The man outside the frame was no longer invisible. He was the pivot around which doubt, suspicion, and the slow unraveling of certainty now turned. Ethan had rehearsed the conversation in his mind for days. Not the photograph itself, not the footage, but a series of carefully chosen questions meant to probe Lena without accusation. He wanted clarity, yet feared the answers he might receive. As evening settled over the Hale residence, he found her in the kitchen, arranging wine glasses with precise, almost ceremonial care. The room smelled faintly of roses from the bouquet she had left on the counter, a remnant of the day that now felt distant and fragile. He cleared his throat, trying for neutrality. "You've been busy lately," he began, voice calm, measured. "Long hours at work, social events. Do you feel like we've been connecting as much as we used to?" Lena looked up, lips curving in a practiced, polite smile. There was warmth in her tone, but it was carefully modulated, as though each word had been weighed against some invisible scale. "We've both had a lot on our plates," she said softly, "but I think we're managing." The answer, though benign, carried an undercurrent of something else: distance, evasion, control. Ethan noticed it immediately, a subtle avoidance of specifics, a refusal to meet the question head-on. Her eyes lingered on the counter, on the bouquet, then drifted to the window as if seeking an escape route from his scrutiny. He pressed gently, choosing his words with caution. "Sometimes I feel disconnected. Moments we share, they feel different. Do you ever feel that way?" Her response was slow, measured, almost deliberate. "I think everyone has moments like that," she said, a soft shrug accompanying the words. "It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It's just life." Silence hung between them, heavy and charged. Ethan realized that the absence of a definitive answer could be more destabilizing than an outright denial. In those moments, Lena wielded power not with lies, but with omission. Every pause, every carefully neutral phrase, forced him to navigate the uncertainty she imposed. The manipulation was subtle. He knew it now, but devastating in its psychological effect. He leaned back slightly, studying her gestures. Fingers smoothing the bouquet, a slow exhale, eyes drifting to the floor. Each movement was deliberate yet unreadable, an exercise in control. Ethan's mind raced, parsing every micro-expression, every syllable, searching for hidden meaning. The more he looked, the more apparent it became. Silence, deflection, and selective truth could destabilize reality far more effectively than outright deceit. "I just want us to understand each other," he said finally, voice quieter now, tinged with frustration. "I don't want secrets between us." Lena's smile remained steady, a thin line of reassurance that felt hollow in the context of the questions asked. "Secrets? I don't think there are any," she replied softly. Yet in her tone, there was a carefully maintained neutrality, a refusal to confirm, a refusal to deny. Ethan felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down. Each question he asked revealed little but implied much, leaving him to interpret absence as presence, inaction as intent. The controlled distance Lena maintained was a barrier he could neither breach nor ignore, a reminder that power often lies not in what is said, but in what is withheld. By the end of the evening, he understood the truth. Confrontation without evidence was a perilous exercise. The photograph, the footage, the background figure, all of it had brought him to this moment. Yet Lena's silence, her careful neutrality, forced him to rely solely on his own perception, magnifying suspicion into an almost tangible presence. Ethan left the kitchen with more questions than answers, knowing that the next step required more than observation. It required uncovering the hidden truths behind actions, gestures, and carefully maintained distance. The silence lingered like a shadow, and in its presence, he understood that the game had only just begun. The silence that followed Ethan's unanswered questions did not fade. It evolved. It settled into the routines of daily life, embedding itself in glances, pauses, and unfinished sentences. What the photograph had hinted at, the days that followed began to confirm through absence rather than evidence. Ethan realized that the image had only captured a fragment. The real story existed beyond the frame, hidden in patterns of behavior and shared secrecy. He began noticing changes in Lena's habits that no photograph could document. Phone calls taken in other rooms. Messages cleared with meticulous efficiency. A new attentiveness to privacy that felt less like independence and more like concealment. These were not acts of passion. They were acts of coordination. Whatever connected Lena to the man outside the frame had grown into something structured, something sustained by mutual understanding and risk. The documentary lens widened to include moments that once seemed inconsequential. A sudden cancellation of dinner plans. A vague explanation that lacked detail. Ethan found himself cataloging these instances with a precision that surprised him. Each omission added weight to the suspicion that this was no fleeting emotional lapse, but a shared secret maintained through discipline and restraint. The confrontation, when it came, was not explosive. It unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as though both understood the inevitability of what was being said. "There are things you're not telling me," Ethan said, his voice steady but strained. It was not an accusation, but an observation shaped by weeks of restraint. Lena's response was immediate yet measured. "Not everything needs to be explained," she replied. Her words were calm, but her posture stiffened, betraying a fracture beneath the composure. "Some things are complicated. Complicated isn't the same as private," Ethan said. "And it isn't the same as harmless." The exchange marked the emotional peak they had been circling. Lena's control wavered just enough to reveal its cost. She admitted to connection, to conversations that extended beyond what she had ever acknowledged. Not framed as betrayal but as necessity. She spoke of understanding, of feeling seen, of choices made gradually rather than deliberately. What emerged was not a confession of romance alone, but of shared ethical compromise. Boundaries crossed quietly, trust displaced carefully, each step justified by silence and rationalization. Ethan realized that the betrayal was not confined to affection. It existed in the mutual decision to obscure truth, to manipulate perception, and to preserve an alternate reality at his expense. The photograph, once central, now felt insufficient. It had shown proximity, but not intention. It had captured a moment, but not the architecture behind it. The real damage lived in what had been hidden deliberately, sustained by cooperation and reinforced by denial. This was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a system. Emotion surfaced despite restraint. Ethan's voice faltered when he spoke of trust, of believing that honesty was the foundation of intimacy. Lena responded with practiced regret, acknowledging pain without fully accepting responsibility. Her words hovered between apology and justification, revealing a fracture that could no longer be concealed. In that moment, Ethan understood that the truth he sought would not arrive cleanly or completely. It would emerge in fragments, shaped by resistance and selective admission. The photo had opened the door, but what lay beyond it was far more complex and unsettling than he had imagined. As the conversation ended, neither offered resolution. The room felt heavier, charged with the recognition that something irreversible had occurred. Ethan withdrew, carrying with him the understanding that uncovering the full scope of what had been hidden would require more than conversation. The photograph had revealed a presence. This chapter revealed intention. And with that realization, Ethan crossed an unseen threshold, leaving behind uncertainty and entering a phase defined not by suspicion alone, but by obsession and consequence. Ethan did not sleep. Nights stretched endlessly, measured by the glow of his phone screen and the slow ticking of the clock above the hallway door. The photograph rested on his desk, face down, yet impossibly present. He no longer needed to see it. Its outlines were burned into memory, a single frozen second that now governed every waking thought. Obsession crept in quietly. It replaced affection with vigilance, tenderness with calculation. Ethan began replaying routines the way others replayed songs, tracing Lena's movements through the house, noting the timing of her departures, the cadence of her messages. Love had once filled the empty spaces. Now suspicion occupied them completely. Sleep deprivation sharpened everything. Sounds felt louder, light harsher. The hum of the refrigerator at night became intrusive, as if the house itself were watching him unravel. In the darkness, Ethan imagined conversations he would never hear, decisions made without him, glances exchanged beyond his sight. Shame followed close behind, whispering that he should have known, that missing the signs was a personal failure. Days passed in fragments. At work, he stared through meetings, nodding at words that failed to register. His reflection in bathroom mirrors looked unfamiliar, eyes ringed with fatigue, jaw clenched as if bracing for impact. Anger surfaced unexpectedly, not explosive but constant, simmering beneath restraint. It was directed nowhere and everywhere at once. The photograph evolved into symbol. It was no longer evidence of a moment but proof of entrapment. Everyone inside it was fixed, unable to move forward or backward. Ethan felt trapped alongside them, suspended between what he believed and what he feared to confirm. The stillness of the image mocked his spiraling thoughts. Isolation became routine. Friends noticed his absence, unanswered calls, delayed replies. He offered vague explanations, conserving energy for the private investigation consuming him. Nights blurred into mornings, mornings into sleepless afternoons. The world narrowed to questions without answers, patterns without resolution. In cinematic flashes, he imagined following Lena, standing across streets, watching reflections in glass storefronts. He never acted on these impulses, yet they lingered vivid and intrusive. The boundary between thought and action thinned, eroded by exhaustion and uncertainty. Ethan recognized the danger but felt powerless to stop the momentum. When Lena spoke, her words seemed distant, filtered through layers of interpretation. Ethan listened less to what she said than to what she omitted. Every pause became significant. Every neutral phrase carried weight. Obsession demanded constant decoding, leaving no room for rest. One night, as dawn crept through the curtains, Ethan turned the photograph face up again. He studied it without emotion, as though detachment might offer relief. Instead, he felt the cost of unanswered questions settle heavily. This was not clarity. It was corrosion. He sat alone in the living room, lights off, letting the quiet press against his chest. The absence of certainty felt physical, a pressure that tightened with every unanswered question. Ethan realized that love had not vanished suddenly. It had eroded grain by grain, replaced by vigilance masquerading as purpose. He was no longer searching for reassurance. He was searching for confirmation. Somewhere beneath the obsession, a harder truth waited. Answers would not soothe him. They would wound. Yet avoidance was no longer possible. The photograph had started this descent, but the next stage would demand action. And with action would come consequences that no amount of preparation could soften. Those consequences would soon force Ethan to confront what silence had protected and what truth was about to destroy. It was only the beginning of a deeper unraveling that would redefine everything he thought he knew about love. The confession did not arrive dramatically. It surfaced the way everything else had, measured, controlled, stripped of emotion that might suggest guilt. Ethan sensed it before Lena spoke, in the way she sat across from him at the dining table, hands folded, posture composed as if preparing for a negotiation rather than an admission. The air between them felt dense, burdened by everything left unsaid. "I think we should talk," she said finally. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. Ethan did not respond immediately. He had learned the value of silence, how it forced truth to reveal itself in uncomfortable increments. He waited, watching her carefully. "There was someone else," Lena continued. She did not look at him when she said it. "It didn't start the way you think. It wasn't reckless." The words landed with weight, yet lacked force. This was not remorse. It was necessity, shaped by inevitability rather than regret. Ethan noticed how she framed the admission. Vague, controlled, incomplete. She offered just enough to acknowledge reality, but not enough to surrender control of the narrative. "How long?" he asked. She hesitated, calculating. "Longer than it should have been," she said. "But it didn't mean what you're imagining." That sentence carried the sharpest sting. It was an attempt to redefine damage, to minimize impact without denying existence. Lena spoke of emotional closeness, of being understood, of circumstances that blurred boundaries gradually. She avoided words like betrayal or deception, choosing language that softened intent and displaced responsibility. Ethan felt a strange detachment as she spoke. His mind noted every deflection, every careful omission. The confession unfolded like a performance designed to limit fallout. There was no acknowledgement of secrecy as harm, no recognition of manipulation as cruelty. Instead, Lena framed the affair as an isolated failure, contained and manageable. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, finally meeting his eyes. Ethan recognized the tactic immediately. Intent replacing outcome. Meaning replacing consequence. It was not an apology. It was an explanation engineered to preserve moral distance. By emphasizing her lack of malicious intent, Lena sought absolution without accountability. "You chose to hide it," Ethan said quietly. "Every day." She exhaled slowly, as if burdened. "I didn't know how to stop without destroying everything." The irony settled heavily between them. Destruction had already occurred. It had simply been delayed. Ethan realized that this confession was not an act of honesty, but containment. A controlled release of truth designed to prevent further inquiry. Details remained vague. Timelines blurred. Names were avoided. Lena answered questions selectively, steering away from specifics that might deepen the wound or expose further compromise. Each answer was precise enough to satisfy on the surface, yet hollow beneath. What unsettled Ethan most was the absence of urgency. Lena did not rush to explain, did not plead for forgiveness. She spoke as though revealing a difficult truth was sufficient on its own, as though acknowledgement equaled resolution. In that moment, Ethan understood that confession could be weaponized. It could be used not to heal, but to close doors, to assert control over how truth was perceived. Lena's admission was not mercy. It was strategy. When the conversation ended, nothing felt resolved. The truth had emerged, but it felt curated, edited to serve the teller rather than the listener. Ethan was left with fragments, aware that the full weight of what had occurred remained deliberately obscured. As Lena left the room, her composure intact, Ethan stayed seated, staring at the empty chair across from him. The confession had confirmed his suspicions, but it had also revealed something deeper. The truth he received would never be complete, only negotiated. And with that realization came a new understanding. The next stage would not be about uncovering facts. It would be about consequences, about what truth, once revealed without mercy, inevitably demands. The days after the confession unfolded without spectacle. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic departures. Instead, the damage revealed itself quietly, in the spaces where certainty once lived. Ethan moved through familiar rooms as if they belonged to someone else, aware that nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt altered beyond repair. Word spread selectively. Not the full truth, never that. Friends noticed distance before explanation. Invitations went unanswered. Conversations became cautious, stripped of intimacy. Ethan sensed how easily narratives adjusted themselves, how betrayal could be softened for public consumption while remaining devastating in private. The wedding photo, once admired, became irrelevant to everyone but him. To the outside world, it was a harmless memory. To Ethan, it was a scar. Lena maintained composure. She continued routines, preserved appearances, and spoke carefully when asked. Her reputation remained intact, shielded by ambiguity and restraint. Ethan understood then that consequences did not distribute themselves evenly. Some losses were visible. Others were internal, corrosive, and invisible to anyone unwilling to look closely. Trust, once assumed, now required effort he could not summon. Ethan questioned not only Lena, but himself. He replayed decisions, wondering where judgment had failed, where perception had been compromised. Betrayal altered his sense of identity, transforming confidence into caution and reflection into doubt. He was no longer certain of his instincts, nor of the boundaries he thought he understood. The documentary tone of his thoughts shifted from investigation to reckoning. There were no new facts to uncover, only realities to absorb. Emotional fallout did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated. A hesitation before answering the phone. A pause before responding to kindness. These were the aftershocks, subtle but persistent. At night, Ethan returned to the photograph, not out of obsession, but out of obligation. It had become a reference point, a reminder of how easily moments could mislead. He noticed now what he had missed before, but the knowledge offered no comfort. The image could not be edited, reframed, or undone. Its permanence mirrored the permanence of consequence. Self-worth suffered quietly. Ethan questioned whether he had been chosen or merely convenient, whether love had been mutual or asymmetrical. These doubts did not seek answers. They lingered, reshaping how he viewed himself and future connection. Betrayal, he learned, does not end with disclosure. It extends into identity, altering how one defines value and trust. The social world adjusted around him. People offered sympathy without understanding, advice without context. Ethan accepted none of it fully. He recognized that healing was not linear and resolution was not guaranteed. Some damage could not be repaired, only acknowledged. As time passed, the emotional intensity dulled, but the consequences remained. The relationship, once central, became peripheral, defined more by absence than presence. Ethan began to understand that survival did not mean restoration. It meant adaptation. The photograph no longer demanded explanation. It had fulfilled its role. What mattered now was what followed, how truth reshaped responsibility. Ethan felt himself moving toward a quieter phase, one less driven by discovery and more by reflection. The chaos had subsided, leaving clarity in its wake, sharp and unyielding. He stood at the edge of something final, aware that understanding alone was insufficient. The story was nearing its conclusion, and with it came a question that could not be avoided. What responsibility does truth demand once it is known? That question lingered, unresolved, guiding him toward an ending that would not offer comfort, but something more enduring. A lesson forged from consequence rather than hope. After the question settled, life did not return to normal. It moved forward differently, stripped of illusion and excess emotion. Ethan chose distance, not as punishment, but as preservation. He occupied a smaller version of his life, one defined by routine and restraint, where reflection replaced reaction. The chaos had passed, leaving clarity in its place, sharp and instructive. His voice returned gradually, not in volume, but in certainty. He no longer searched for missing explanations or imagined alternate endings. What had happened existed as fact, unchangeable and complete. The awareness was not comforting, but it was grounding. Healing, he learned, was not resolution. It was recognition. Ethan began to understand accountability in broader terms. Betrayal was not only an act, but a series of choices protected by silence and rationalization. He recognized his own role not in the deception, but in the assumptions that allowed it to remain hidden. Trust without vigilance, he realized, carried its own risks. The wedding photo lost its emotional charge. It became an artifact rather than an accusation. Publicly, it meant nothing. Privately, it remained a reminder of how easily truth could be obscured when appearances were prioritized over honesty. Ethan no longer avoided the image, nor did he linger on it. His power diminished as understanding replaced fixation. Distance between Ethan and Lena solidified into permanence. There were no final conversations, no dramatic closure. Responsibility did not require reconciliation. What mattered was acknowledgement, and the acceptance that some fractures do not heal. They simply define boundaries. Ethical failure, once exposed, demanded consequence, not forgiveness. Reflection replaced obsession. Ethan rebuilt his sense of self deliberately, questioning assumptions and recalibrating trust. He learned to listen for absence as much as presence, to recognize that silence often carries intention. Vigilance became a form of respect for himself rather than suspicion of others. The narrative, once driven by discovery, now rested in understanding. Secrets, he realized, do not remain contained. They expand quietly, shaping behavior, distorting perception, and demanding payment long before they are revealed. Truth, when delayed, exacts a heavier price. Ethan carried this lesson forward, not as bitterness, but as awareness. He understood that morality is tested not in moments of exposure, but in moments of concealment. The cost of ethical failure extended beyond relationships into identity itself. As the frame faded, the story did not end with restoration, but with responsibility. Ethan stepped away from what had been, conscious of what must not be repeated. The photograph had captured a moment. The aftermath defined a life. In the end, the caution remained clear and enduring. Truth does not disappear when ignored. It waits. And when it surfaces, it demands recognition, accountability, and a reckoning that no amount of silence can prevent. The experience reshaped how Ethan viewed connection itself. He no longer believed that love alone was sufficient to sustain honesty. It required courage, consistency, and the willingness to confront discomfort before it hardened into damage. These realizations followed him quietly, influencing choices yet to be made. There was no sense of victory in this awareness. Only responsibility. Awareness meant carrying knowledge forward, applying it with care. Ethan accepted that vigilance was not cynicism, but attentiveness to reality. It was the price of maturity earned through loss. The story closed without spectacle, grounded in consequence. What remained was not closure, but clarity. And clarity, Ethan understood, was enough to move forward without illusions, carrying truth as obligation rather than burden. He understood now that endings rarely arrive cleanly. They linger, shaping perception long after events conclude. Ethan accepted that vigilance would guide future choices, not as fear, but as ethical awareness. He would question appearances, respect intuition, and value transparency. These lessons, earned painfully, became his quiet resolve. The frame had faded, but its implications remained active, influencing how he listened, trusted, and committed. In this awareness, Ethan found something stable. Not hope, but responsibility. And responsibility, he realized, was the most honest conclusion available. marking the true end of the story and the beginning of living with truth. Forward motion required memory, discipline, and restraint, ensuring the past informed decisions without dominating the future. That balance defined survival, growth, and ethical clarity. The story reinforces that emotional betrayal is not harmless. Secrecy is a moral choice, and truth, when delayed, causes deeper damage. Vigilance, honesty, and ethical responsibility are presented not as ideals, but necessities with real psychological consequences.